June 1st, 2016 was the day I finished my first ever playthrough of The Last of Us on PS3. I didn't have a PS4 at the time, so I couldn't play the remastered version, but I did have an old used PS3 off of eBay and a used copy from GameStop. And when I finished it, I immediately played it again. And when I finished that, I played it a third time. And when I finished that, I actually stopped playing it for a while, but that's still 3 playthroughs in a row. And to this day, it is the only game I have ever replayed immediately after finishing it, let alone the only one where I've done it twice. I just wasn't ready to leave that world. I wasn't ready to leave Joel and Ellie. I wasn't ready to lose that story. There had simply never been a game that made me feel quite the way the original Last of Us made me feel. And frankly, aside from maybe its own sequel, which I swear I will eventually make a video on someday, there hasn't been a game that has done it since. There are many games that have come close, Life is Strange, Uncharted 4, Red Dead Redemption 2, but none have been able to quite get to that same level for me. The Last of Us opened me up to a whole new world of feeling and what a video game could do or even be. Hell, what a story could do or be. And I've since played it several more times across both the remastered version on PS4 and the recent PS5 remake. And I tell you all of this because I want you to know exactly how much this game means to me. This isn't just a game that I really liked or that I had a lot of fun with or that made me cry. This is a game that has had a profound influence on me. It changed so much of how I view people and the world, and it is probably the single story that has influenced me the most as a prospective storyteller. The Last of Us is incredibly important to me, and my adoration for it has only grown with each successive playthrough. So when HBO released a 9-episode season of TV based on the game, I felt almost obligated to watch it. With so much talent involved, including the original creative director of both games, Neil Druckmann, I knew it was something that was going to be made with love, care, and a deep respect for the original story. But I weirdly wasn't all that excited about it, to be honest. I wasn't dreading it or anything. I was pretty confident I would enjoy it, probably even love it, but there just wasn't a lot of excitement in me about it, to the point where I didn't even get around to watching it until well after it had finished. And now that I have, I'm here to ask a simple question. Why adapt The Last of Us? Or more broadly speaking, why adapt any story at all? Make no mistake that adaptation is no recent development in artistic creation. Humans have been adapting stories for as long as they've been telling them, but why? In a world that seems to greatly value artistic originality, why do we keep telling the same stories we always have? Why do we keep making new movies based on Macbeth? Why are some of the biggest movies of today adaptations of comic books? Why do we need a new version of The Last of Us when the original version already means so much to so many, including myself? There are obvious practical reasons, of course, money, accessibility, but what artistic reason is there? What artistic purpose is there in telling the same story in a new medium? Why do we care so much about video games being adapted properly when we already have the original games that aren't going anywhere anytime soon? That's the question I seek to answer, and I think there's no better way to start than by considering a question that stands right beside it. How does The Last of Us adapt the game? The question of adaptation is ultimately a question of dependence, as in how much do you depend on what already worked in the original source material, and how much do you try to break away from the original to carve your own path? What do you change and what do you keep the same? And a lot of that is simply a matter of considering how each medium functions. Take, for example, the beginnings of both game and show. The game begins with a slow build of dread in the early morning of Outbreak Day, with the player controlling young Sarah as she creeps through her home at night, the player being fed exposition in small doses through interactable items and environmental storytelling as it slowly ratchets up the tension bit by bit until it eventually explodes into a chaotic mess of carnage and destruction, leading to the horrible death of Sarah. The purpose of the game's opening 15 minutes is to place the player directly into the shoes of Sarah, a young kid with limited information watching the world fall apart around her, confusion and fear dominating her mind. But the show does something a little different, giving us not just the early morning of Outbreak Day, but the entire day preceding it. And the reason for this change, I think, is pretty clear. pacing. You see, once the show catches up to where the game starts, they take a similar amount of time to get through the same general material, with everything in the show prior to that adding about 10 minutes of story that wasn't in the original. But the pacing feels the same, because pacing isn't how long something takes, it's how long something feels like it takes. And in a game where you're going through each and every minute action step by step, 15 minutes feels like a lot more time than it does in a show where the audience is merely a passive observer and things can be precisely edited to keep a smoother flow. And thus, if the show started here instead of here, it would feel much more jarring and disjointed. The tension would be weaker and our level of care for what's happening wouldn't be as high, even though it's taking a very similar amount of time. So how do you combat this but by stretching out the time it takes to get through this prologue, feeding us much of the same exposition as what we get in the game, but in smaller doses spread further out. Watching Sarah go through her day as she notices stranger and stranger things intruding on her familiar world until eventually we reach the point where that world completely falls apart. You achieve the same level of mounting tension, the audience cares more about Sarah than they would have, and we ultimately get a similar emotional experience to the game, but one that better suits the medium it's in, while also incidentally giving us a closer look at the nature of Joel and Sarah's relationship, something we only got a glimpse of in the game. We get to see just how dependent Joel was on Sarah, with how she gets him up every morning, makes his breakfast, fixes his watch because he was never gonna do it himself, and we see just how oblivious Joel seemed to be to that fact.
Oh, he loves you.
He's dependent on me. Not the same.
That's a major aspect of what adaptation is able to achieve, finding new dimensions to familiar characters or ideas. And in this case, much of that comes from the differences in how a game and show each convey perspective. In a game, the conveyance of perspective comes kind of unearned. Because you're playing as a character in the story, even if just as a vessel for yourself, the game doesn't really need to establish perspective in any other way, because for all intents and purposes, the game is told from your perspective. Of course, you only see and hear what Joel sees and hears because you're playing as him. And if the player character doesn't see or hear what you do, the game has to go out of its way to convey that. But with a show or movie, perspective has to be conveyed more deliberately. Information has to be communicated in more precise visual and auditory ways, and thus that changes the way the audience experiences that perspective emotionally. Take this shot from the same beginning section of the show we just discussed, where Granny Smith over here is starting to bug out because she's been infected by cordyceps. Obviously we can see this, but Sarah can't, and that's conveyed fairly simply through the shallow focus. The focus is on Sarah looking through the shelf, blissfully unaware of what's out of focus, what we're seeing. In that, while the show is visually conveying at least a part of Sarah's perspective, we remain firmly outside of it, separating our experience of this moment from Sarah's. With a show, there is a palpable distance between you and the perspectives of the characters, but with a game, your controller works to bridge that distance. And so while a game somewhat limits you by planting you in the player character's perspective, allowing you only to see and hear what they see and hear, similar to a sort of third-person limited point of view, a show's use of perspective can be a bit more loose, closer to a third-person omniscient point of view, where we may have access to multiple different perspectives all at the same time, including our own, and whose perspective we're seeing things from can shift with any given cut. Take this moment here, late into the first episode, where we're seeing things mostly from Joel and Tess's perspective as Tess closes the door on Ellie, Ellie's voice getting cut off as she does so. But then we're in the room with Ellie. The voices of Joel and Tess outside are now muffled and unintelligible because that's what Ellie's hearing. In just a single cut, the perspective changes completely. And what this allows for in the show is perhaps the greatest difference between the two versions of this story. While the vast majority of the original game is told from the perspective of Joel and Ellie exclusively because that was kind of its only option, the show is able to explore other perspectives. And so, while we may only have gotten to see Tess when she was with Joel in the game, in the show we can see her in scenes where Joel isn't present and see how she acts around other people when Joel isn't around. And not only do we get to see new dimensions to characters like Tess, we also also get to see new dimensions to this world, because we get to see it from so many more perspectives than before. We find characters that we've never seen before. We discover new ways of thinking about concepts we thought we knew everything about. The hunters suddenly become more than just scary, faceless villains whom we never get to meet because the story never demanded it. They're people with relationships and beliefs of their own, people they've lost, people that depend on them, people consumed by vengeance to the point that they lose sight of their priorities. And in response to that new level of complexity, Henry becomes not just a survivor, but a traitor, a man who gave up someone he admired and a cause he believed in because he was desperate to keep his younger brother safe and healthy. Suddenly, there are all these new layers of emotional complexity that the original game simply couldn't afford because of the nature of its medium. But this results in something kind of interesting. The Last of Us is a game about relationships. That is one of the clearest things about it. And just about every character in the game is in some way a lesson about relationships that Joel and or Ellie need to learn, whether it's the importance of allowing agency, the necessity of vulnerability, or the potentially terrifying consequences of unfettered trust. And of course, the interactive nature of the game puts a focus on the player forming something of a bond with other characters through your reliance on them to progress. But because of the lack of that interactivity, plus the new sense of perspective that the medium of television offers and the new focus on side characters and world building that comes from that, the focus on relationships isn't quite as strong. It's still there, certainly, but the show seems to have a much greater focus on the individual character development than it does on the development of those relationships. And there's no better example of that than the two characters at the center of that story. But before we look into the Joel and Ellie of the show, I want to take just a second to look at the Joel and Ellie of the game to give us a base to work with. And Joel and Ellie in the game are practically polar opposites. Joel is a closed-off man, beaten down by a world that took his daughter away from him. He doesn't want to be close with anyone and doesn't want any kind of relationship beyond the most shallow and practical. Meanwhile, Ellie is a very open and curious person. She seeks out relationships wherever she can find them. She's optimistic, or at least not completely jaded, even though she's faced her fair share of tragedy. She has an innocence about her that has yet to be fully corrupted, always ready with a joke from her lovely pun book. And the story of these two is a simple one on the surface: an older man learning to care about somebody again, and a young girl losing her sense of innocence to a harsh, unforgiving world. And for the most part, all of this remains true of the show as well. The show's Joel is beaten down. He is hesitant to trust people. The show's Ellie is curious, and she does love a good pun. But with the new sense of perspective, we get to see Joel and Ellie in ways we'd never got to see them before. We see new aspects that change the characters in small but deeply significant ways. There's a scene about halfway through the second episode where Joel, Tess, and Ellie encounter a pile of rubble as they're moving through a building. Joel helps Tess up above it so that she can find them a way through, leaving Joel and Ellie alone. And I find their interaction here interesting because it's an interaction that doesn't quite feel like anything we saw in the game. For one thing, it's Joel that first tries to make conversation, not Ellie, who completely blows him off, only starting to ask questions because she feels she's being forced to. She seems kinda over this whole thing, actually.
What about Tess?
Detroit. It's in Michigan.
I go to school. I know where Detroit is.
It's only when Ellie starts to pry at his relationship with Tess and his history that Joel pushes back. But when she starts asking about what it's like to kill infected, what it's like to know they were once people, Joel may not be too open about it, but he's not closed off either. I bring up this scene specifically because I think it serves as a nice microcosm of the key differences between these characters in the show and their original counterparts. Joel is still hardened, but not quite as much. He is still closed off, but not quite as much. Joel is generally softer here than he is in the game. Not soft, certainly not soft, but softer. When Ellie shoots a man trying to kill Joel in the game, he gets mad at her, yells at her about it, angrier that Ellie didn't listen to him than thankful that she saved his life. But when a similar scene plays out in the show, Joel apologizes for putting her in that kind of a position, not only seeming to want to retain Ellie's innocence, but also clearly ashamed of his own physical weakness and his inability to protect himself. That weakness is perhaps the biggest difference between game Joel and show Joel. In the game, Joel is more than capable of everything that he has to do, mostly because the player needs to be more than capable of everything he has to do. Joel certainly has an age to him, and he's definitely not at his peak physical prowess, and the game tries to communicate that, mostly through cutscenes, but it's nowhere to be seen in the gameplay, because that weakness could all too easily just become a distracting annoyance for most players. Hell, one of Show Joel's greatest weaknesses is the fact that he's mostly deaf in one ear, which would make the listening mechanic of the game not nearly as useful. But the show doesn't have to consider that. There is no interactive element, so Joel's age, his slowly but surely failing body, can be communicated with much greater ease and be given much greater focus. There's a vulnerability to Joel that doesn't exist in quite the same way or to quite the same extent in the game, and in that, Joel's primary conflict changes a bit. While he is still afraid of getting too close to Ellie, the reason he fears that is because he fears that he won't be able to protect Ellie in the same way that he couldn't protect Sarah. It's not the inevitability of loss that scares him as much as his inability to prevent it. It's the fear that he can't be depended on and thus doesn't really have a purpose. In what was for me probably the season's most heartbreaking scene, Joel tells his brother Tommy about all of this. Tells him that he's not who he used to be, he's too slow, he can't hear, he's afraid. He has dreams that he can't remember.
I just know that when I wake up, I've lost something.
I want to give a lot of credit to Pedro Pascal and his performance here. It's one of the only performances in the show that I honestly prefer to its original counterpart. He plays that softer characterization of Joel alongside the harder remnants of the original with such a wonderful authenticity. But this version of the character is ultimately founded in the writing, in the considerations of how the character can and must change for the sake of the new medium. Sure, he could have been just as hard as he was in the game, just as angry and bitter and capable, but instead they chose to explore a new aspect of the character they couldn't before. They chose to explore a dimension to the character that this new medium helped them to discover, and that same choice stands for Ellie. To begin talking about Ellie, I want to talk about a major change the show made to one of the game's most infamous scenes. In the game, young Sam is bitten on the leg as he, Joel, Ellie, and his older brother Henry are escaping a horde of infected, but nobody knows he's bitten except for him. And with this secret, he asks Ellie what she's scared of, and she tells him that she's afraid of ending up alone. By the end of their conversation, Ellie leaves the room oblivious to Sam's condition, and the next morning, Sam has turned and attacks Ellie. Henry, after a moment of hesitation, has to kill his younger brother, and overcome with immediate and intense grief and guilt, he shoots himself. It's one of the hardest scenes in the game to experience, an emotionally devastating sequence of events that came just when everything seemed like it was going to be alright for a while. And the show's version of this scene differs very little. It's almost exactly the same, in fact, except for one major change. Sam tells Ellie that he's been bitten, and instead of going to Joel and Henry in the other room to try and figure out what to do, perhaps even avoiding the horrific scene from the game, Ellie takes it upon herself to smear her blood over the wound, hoping that her immunity will be able to save Sam's life. But it doesn't, and the scene plays out the same way it did in the game. But that one change is huge to me, because it creates an internal conflict not really all that present in the original. Having this alongside that admittance of Ellie that she fears ending up alone shows an interesting contrast within Ellie. She fears ending up alone, but she also seeks to prove her independence, her ability to solve problems on her own without the assistance of others. That, to me, is the biggest change between Game Ellie and Show Ellie. Game Ellie wasn't worried about being overdependent, but Show Ellie is. Show Ellie isn't as open to new people or relationships. She's much more distanced than Game Ellie is, Bella Ramsey helping to give her a much sharper edge. Don't get me wrong, Game Ellie is no pushover, but Show Ellie is just meaner. Game Ellie said sorry before stabbing a soldier in the leg, but Show Ellie didn't. Show Ellie is more defensive, ready to push back against any blame for Tess's death, while Game Ellie just assumed and accepted that blame without question. Show Ellie is constantly on guard, readier to assume that someone is going to try and take away her knife than that they're going to unlock her chains. She still retains a certain level of innocence, but she also seems to already know how bad the world can be and how easily you can lose people you care about, and just how much worse it is when you really depended on them. And all of that was in the game as well, but the show shines a spotlight on it, makes that aspect of the character more central, and provides new context to scenes like I'm Not Her. Despite few, if any, significant differences between the two versions of that scene, even a lot of the dialogue is the same, they feel like they're communicating two related but overall different ideas. In the game, the scene is about affirming Ellie's fear that she's unwanted, just a burden on others. But in this new context, it's about affirming Ellie's fear that the people she depends on will always eventually leave her. Again, both these ideas are present in both versions, but where it differs is focus. In the game, Ellie is more focused on how she affects other people, while in the show, she's more focused on how she affects herself, and that follows well with how she's represented in either medium. For most of the game, we only really know Ellie in relation to other people, specifically ourselves and Joel, because that's who we're playing as. But in the show, we're allowed so much more often to get to know Ellie independent of Joel, aided by the distance of perspective between the audience and the fiction. We get to see Ellie's anger towards the world that has taken so much from her. We get to see her interact with other characters like Marlene without the presence of Joel. We get to see her more romantic view of violence, that thing that is necessary for proving her independence in the world of The Last of Us. She needs to be able to hurt others, to kill them if necessary, and when she kills David near the end of the season, just like she did near the end of the game, it is proof that she is capable of inflicting that violence. She is more than capable of saving herself, but she still embraces Joel when he finds her, blood splattered on her face, desperate to feel safe. Both Joel and Ellie in the show are characters who need to learn that it's okay to lean on others, that it's okay to lean on each other. While Joel is trying to prove that he can be depended on, trying to prove that no one under his care will need to take care of him or themselves, Ellie is trying to prove that she can be completely independent, that she doesn't need to depend on anyone. And in that embrace is an acceptance from the both of them, the acceptance of Joel that Ellie doesn't always need him to save her, and the acceptance of Ellie that she still needs Joel to be there for her. It's a moment of balance between them, and if it had stopped there, perhaps things would have been fine. But in that final episode, Look for the Light, there is a clear issue. When Joel pushes through that Firefly hospital, slaughtering anyone and everyone in his way to find and save Ellie's life, choosing his love for her over the fate of the species, it's clear this is not because he wants to protect her, but because he wants to protect himself.
So time heals all wounds, I guess.
It wasn't time that did it.
Joel has now become dependent on Ellie. His life now has no meaning without her. If he loses her the same way he did Sarah, then he will have nothing left to live for. And in that, Ellie chooses to allow Joel to depend on her, allows him to lie to her so that she can accept the role, the purpose that Joel has placed on her, and all this feels just a little bit rushed, doesn't it? As I was writing this, I kind of felt like I was rushing it a little, but then I realized that there is actually no better way to represent how the end of the first season of The Last of Us made me feel. I'm not going to say that I didn't like it or that it worked on 0 levels, but the truth is that when I got to that ending, probably one of my favorite endings in any work of fiction ever in the game, I felt a small twinge in my head that said, that's it? And I think it's just because, like I said a while ago, despite all of this being rooted in the themes of dependence and relationships, the show has a comparable lack of focus on that central relationship. It's so focused on exploring the individual characters of not just Joel and Ellie, but of several other side characters, that Joel and Ellie's relationship isn't quite as strong for me. And for this ending to work for me on the same level it did in the game, that relationship needed to be stronger. Out of the 9 episodes of this first season, there's only really 4 that I can say were really about Joel and Ellie's relationship. All the others are more about side characters or focus entirely on Joel or Ellie as individual people. Meanwhile, the game spends almost all of its time on developing the relationship of Joel and Ellie. They are rarely separated and constantly interacting. We not only witness but experience each and every step of that development as it happens through the gameplay. But we just don't have that here. The choice Joel has to make is one that should feel more significant than it did for me. He's having to choose not just who to save, but who to let die. The girl he looks at now as a daughter, his purpose for going on, the thing he found to fight for, or all the people who will now die because he allowed the world to stay as it is. And that choice feels like an afterthought to me, a prerequisite because this is the ending of the game, so it has to be the ending of the show as well. And that brings me back around to my original question. Why adapt The Last of Us? Why adapt this game? Do all of these new things only for it to deflate at the very end? Why do all of these new and different things if it just means that the most important part of the story isn't going to work on the same level? Well, this is half the answer. And to find the other half, there's one last thing I want to talk about. Long Time is perhaps the part of the game that is most radically changed for the show. It bears very little resemblance to anything that happened in the game beyond the most basic elements, telling a story that was nowhere to be found in the original. And I fully get why that is. Bill's Town in the original game is mostly a lot of long sequences of stealth and exploration. Most of the story of Bill's Town is Joel and Ellie beginning to get to know one another as the player searches the town for supplies and collectibles. It's not really something that would translate super well into an hour-long episode of television. So the show chooses to spend about the first 15 minutes on something similar. Joel and Ellie going from place to place and talking about different things, only for almost the entire rest of the episode to focus on the story of Bill from Outbreak Day to the present day of the narrative, giving us more of Bill than we ever got in the original. And the story of Bill in the original is a tragic one. It's a story about a man obsessed with survival, paranoid and delusional, angry and bitter about everything and everyone. Before you get to him in the game, he had a falling out with his partner, Frank, who left him. And eventually the story leads Joel, Ellie, and Bill to a house where a body hangs. The body of Frank, who committed suicide after being bit as he tried to escape the town he felt trapped in. And by the time Joel and Ellie leave Bill behind, pushing forward into the unknown, Bill has learned nothing. He's just as angry, just as bitter as he's always been, and as far as we know, that's how he remained until the end of his days. Angry, bitter, and alone. The original purpose of Bill's Town and Bill as a character was to show Joel a reflection of himself, someone who cared only about survival and nothing else, someone who lost the people he cared about because he refused to change. This is who Joel could become if he chooses not to embrace the opportunity he now has with Ellie. In the game, Bill is a warning of what may be lost. But the show changes that. Not only does the show give us the entire story of Bill and Frank, making their romantic relationship explicit rather than merely implied, it also chooses not to make it a tragedy. It's not a man refusing to change and losing everything that really mattered in the process. It's a story of how scary change can be. It gives us a new dimension to Bill, showing us not just an angry, bitter man, but one who's awkward and afraid. Someone who prioritizes survival because survival is much easier to guarantee than relationships with other people. It's a story about a man finding a new perspective on life, learning that there may be other things worth prioritizing besides just survival. Maybe there is a place for beauty, maybe there's a place for love, maybe it's worth trading a gun for some strawberries because what is even the point of life if you can't enjoy strawberries? This is a story about a man choosing against all his better instincts to take a chance and finding not just something beautiful, but the thing he'd been missing his entire life. Maybe just finding what works and sticking to that isn't enough. And while that's a very similar lesson to the game, it was only in the show that I finally learned it. 2023 has been so far in many ways an amazing year for me and my channel, especially after a rather abysmal 2022. Views have been up and they've never been more consistently solid in the history of my channel. I hit 100,000 subscribers this year. I'm making more money this year. Things have been good, but it has been marred in some ways by a feeling, or rather a lack of feeling. Pretty much all year, I've been struggling to motivate myself to even make these videos because the excitement just isn't there like it used to be. And I think I can attribute that to the simple fact that I've gotten complacent. I found a way to make videos that worked, structures and ways of writing that were perfectly functional. Hell, I'm pretty sure that most of the videos I've made since the Rise of the Planet of the Apes video in 2020 have all followed the same basic structure. And while I am still very proud of all, or at least most of those videos, I think I felt the limitations of it long before I realized it. Putting so much time and effort into making each and every video and then finishing it, posting it, and then all of a sudden I'm staring down the very beginning of the exact same process. I felt stuck like a hamster on a wheel, just going around in circles and never reaching true fulfillment. I became over-dependent on the way I do things. I had an understanding that this would happen pretty much since I started, and I figured I would just adapt automatically, that as I went on, my videos would naturally change over time, because I think we as people have some sense that that's just how adaptation works. But I don't think adaptation in the sense that I'm talking about it works in quite the same way. It is all too easy to find what works and just do that. Become complacent and slowly start to lose the excitement and perhaps even the love that made you do it in the first place, left confused and uncertain at what happened. It would have been easy for this show to just tell the same story of the game beat for beat. You already have something that works, just do it again. But this is a new environment with new challenges to be overcome, and if you're going to succeed, you cannot rely on some accidental mutation. You cannot assume you will do it automatically. You have to adapt purposefully. You have to go into the mysterious wilderness of new ideas and perspectives and be willing to not only accept, but embrace the unfamiliar and scary things that you may find there, the new stories to tell. Frank still dies in the end. As he ages, his body starts to fail, his life is not the same as it was, and he is no longer able to do the things that made life worth living for him. And so he asks Bill to give him one last great day, and then in their last meal, give him a spiked drink that will allow him to die peacefully in his bed. Bill begrudgingly agrees to do this, but when it comes time to give him his drink, it turns out that Bill has spiked his own as well, choosing to die with Frank instead of going on without him. But as Bill says, this is no tragedy. He's old and he's satisfied, and he's not willing to go on when his reason for survival isn't with him anymore. This is no tragedy. This is Bill willing to lose what he used to believe was the greatest priority, his own survival, so that he doesn't have to lose the man that he loves. And he leaves a note for Joel to tell him that he was wrong for hating the world, because there was one person worth saving. And in the end, the show still achieves exactly what the original game did, showing Joel that he needs to take this opportunity he has with Ellie, but it does so not by showing Joel what he might lose, but instead what he might gain. Adaptation is often a process of coming to terms with what you may lose, but also realizing what you can gain. This show gives several different definitions of what love is and isn't, both explicitly and implicitly. Love is not dependence, love is dependence. Love is prioritizing someone over everything else. Love is being there for somebody when they need you. But my favorite definition of love that The Last of Us gives, not to say the definitive or sole correct one, but just my personal favorite, is the definition that Frank gives. It's paying attention to things. And I think that's what it means to adapt, whether you're adapting a story or yourself. It is about paying attention to what you have and considering what you'll have to lose, but it is also about understanding what you may gain from the process. I think I focus too often on the loss. I worry so much about what I'm going to lose if I change something that I forget the possible, even inevitable gains, whether that is a loss of money or comfort or whatever else. And I want to change that. Save who you can save can be used almost as a thesis statement for this first season as a whole, if only because it implies the reality that there will be people you cannot save, people who will be taken from you, things that you will lose by no choice of your own. And sometimes, in trying to save one thing, you may lose another. And so life can become a series of choices about what's worth losing and what's worth saving. And only you know what those things are for you. And they will differ greatly between different people. That is practically the basis of The Last of Us, both show and game. A bunch of different people who disagree about what's worth saving and what's worth losing. Different people who disagree about how to balance the good with the bad. It can be difficult to find the balance between loss and gain, dependence and independence. The lines can often be murky or even non-existent at times. Sometimes the best we can do is make those choices. Lose what we lose, gain what we gain, save what we save, and try to learn from the experience as best we can. The show loses the strength of that core relationship between Joel and Ellie. I do really feel that way. It loses that because it gives up those incredibly vital sequences from the game like Bill's Town. That section was critical to laying the foundation for Joel and Ellie's relationship, but in turn, it gains an episode of television that so many people resonated with for so many reasons, including myself. They made the choice of what was worth losing and what was worth saving, and they found new stories, characters, dimensions that we never saw before, and there are parts of it that work for me, there are parts of it that don't. But whether or not you think they did right in what choices they made, in what they believed to be the things worth saving, I think there is an inherent beauty to the fact that we can make those choices at all. To me, the reason we adapt stories is because artistic adaptation stands as a testament to humanity's ability to hold on in the midst of loss and to find new ways forward that we otherwise would never have seen. I find myself now with a choice. Do I save the ease and the comfort of what I have already found works, or do I lose that by pushing myself to go beyond it and find new, unfamiliar horizons? And the truth is that I want to learn. I want to branch out. I want to push myself beyond my boundaries of comfort. Damn it, I want to grow. And the lesson I've had to learn is that I can't grow if I don't try. It was June 1st, 2016, when I finished my first ever playthrough of The Last of Us on PS3. That was over 7 years ago. And The Last of Us and its sequel will probably remain one of my favorite stories ever told, and one of the greatest influences on me as a person and as an artist. It will always be so important to me, but I think it's time to find some new influences.